When Elijah woke up that morning, he expected it to be just another difficult day, doing whatever he could to survive in a town where no one truly knew him. But little did he know, this day would push him to his breaking point. As Elijah went about his usual task of asking for food to feed his so-called sick mother, the people in town began to notice something was off. Their suspicions grew as Elijah's vague responses and hurried exits raised even more questions. But what no one could have guessed was the heartbreaking truth he was hiding, not just from them, but from the entire world. And when a compassionate cop decided to follow him, what he uncovered didn't just shock the town. It changed everything for Elijah forever. Before we dive into this emotional journey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you're ready to be moved by Elijah's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The autumn wind whistled through the narrow streets of Pine Grove, a small town where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. Fallen maple leaves danced across the cracked sidewalks as 8-year-old Elijah Williams darted between buildings, clutching an old canvas bag close to his chest. His worn sneakers, 2 sizes too big and secured with double-knotted laces, slapped against the concrete as he ran, occasionally glancing over his shoulder as if pursued by unseen eyes. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the town square. The courthouse clock struck 5, its deep chimes echoing through the nearly empty streets. Most shops were closing for the day, their owners flipping signs from open to closed and counting their daily earnings. But Elijah knew one place would still be open, Tom's Diner, which stood like a beacon at the corner of Maple and Fifth. The diner's neon sign flickered to life as dusk approached, casting a warm red glow on the wet pavement. Through the large windows, Elijah could see the usual evening crowd starting to gather. Mr. Wilson from the hardware store settling into his regular booth, Mrs. Jenkins sipping her evening coffee at the counter, and a few truckers taking their dinner break. The familiar smell of fried potatoes, coffee, and today's meatloaf special wafted through the air, making Elijah's empty stomach growl so loudly he wrapped his arms around himself to muffle the sound. He paused outside, watching his reflection in the window. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, making him look older than his 8 years. His clothes, though clean, hung loose on his thin frame. A blue sweater that had seen better days, jeans with patches at the knees, and those oversized sneakers. He tried to smooth down his curly black hair, which had grown too long without proper trimming, then took a deep breath to compose himself before pushing open the glass door, causing the small bell above to chime. The warmth inside the diner enveloped him immediately, along with the comforting sounds of clinking plates, quiet conversation, and the sizzle of burgers on the grill. The jukebox in the corner played an old Elvis song, its melody mixing with the hum of fluorescent lights and the whir of the ceiling fans. Behind the counter, Tom Peterson looked up from wiping down the surface, his weathered face breaking into a gentle smile as he recognized the young visitor. Tom was a fixture in Pine Grove, as much a part of the town as the old oak tree in the square. He'd run the diner for 23 years, ever since taking it over from his father. His salt and pepper hair and laugh lines spoke of years spent listening to customer stories, solving their problems over cups of coffee, and feeding anyone who walked through his doors, paying or not. "Well, if it isn't my friend Elijah," Tom said, setting aside his checkered cleaning cloth. "Haven't seen you in a couple of days. Was starting to worry about you, kiddo." Elijah approached the counter, his fingers nervously playing with a loose thread on his bag. The vinyl-covered stool squeaked as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, not quite meeting Tom's eyes. "Hi, Mr. Tom," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the diner's ambient noise. I was wondering if you had any extra food today. My mom is still sick, and she hasn't been able to cook." Tom's smile faltered slightly as he studied the boy's face. He'd heard this same story several times over the past few weeks, and something about it didn't quite add up. The diner owner had been around long enough to know when something wasn't right, and his instincts were screaming that this was one of those times. "Your mama's been sick for quite a while now, hasn't she?" Tom asked carefully, reaching for a clean takeout container. He noticed how Elijah's shoulders tensed at the question, how his eyes darted toward the door like a cornered animal looking for escape. "What seems to be the trouble?" Elijah shifted his weight again, his sneakers squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. The doctor said she needs lots of rest, he replied, the words coming out practiced and rehearsed, as if he'd said them many times before. She gets really tired real easy. Can't even get out of bed, most days. At the counter, Mrs. Jenkins pretended to focus on her coffee, but her ears perked up at the conversation. She'd heard rumors about the Williams boy and his mysterious sick mother, and like many in town, she'd never actually seen the woman. Tom nodded slowly as he filled the container with generous portions of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans from the day's specials. The steam fogged up the plastic lid as he secured it, then reached for another container. "You know, Elijah," he said, keeping his voice gentle, "I make a mean chicken soup that works wonders for sick folks. My own mama's recipe, passed down through 3 generations of Petersons. Maybe I could bring some by your house tomorrow? Checking on your mama." Panic flashed across Elijah's face before he could hide it, his small hands clutching the strap of his bag, so tightly his knuckles turned white. "No," he said quickly, then caught himself, trying to smooth his voice into something calmer. "I mean, she doesn't want any visitors right now. The doctor said she needs to stay quiet and not have people around. But thank you, Mr. Tom." Tom added a slice of apple pie to the second container, watching as Elijah's eyes followed his movements, a mixture of hunger and anxiety in his gaze. "At least tell me where you live, so I know where to find you if you need anything. It's getting darker earlier these days, and I don't like the thought of you walking home alone." We're just outside town," Elijah mumbled, already backing toward the door as Tom handed him the food containers. "Thank you for the food, Mr. Tom. I gotta go now. Mama's waiting." Before Tom could say another word, Elijah was gone, disappearing into the growing darkness outside. The bell chimed his departure, and Tom watched through the window as the boy hurried away, his small figure soon swallowed by shadows. The food containers, still warm, were clutched protectively against his chest as he ran. "That boy's hiding something," Mrs. Jenkins said, breaking the silence that had fallen over the diner. She set down her coffee cup with a definitive clink. "I've lived in this town 43 years, Tom, and I've never once seen his mother. Not at church, not at the grocery store, not even at the doctor's office. And heaven knows I spend enough time there with my arthritis to see everyone who comes and goes." Tom sighed, picking up his cleaning cloth again. "I know, Martha. Something's not right there, but I can't figure out what it is. The boy's obviously hungry, and I can't turn him away, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Have you thought about calling the police?" Mr. Wilson called from his booth, having overheard the conversation. "Could be something serious going on there. And what if we're wrong?" Tom countered. "What if his mama really is sick, and we make things worse by getting authorities involved? No, we need to handle this carefully. That boy's scared of something, and I don't want to make it worse." 2 days later, morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost coating the grass and fall flowers fighting their last battle against the approaching winter. Elijah found himself standing outside Mrs. Robinson's bakery, gathering his courage. He hadn't been here in almost 2 weeks, and his stomach churned with anxiety. But he needed food, and he couldn't go back to Tom's diner too soon. That would raise suspicions. The bakery sat on Cherry Street, its blue and white striped awning making it stand out among the brick buildings. The display window showcased an array of breads, pastries, and cakes, all arranged with Mrs. Robinson's artistic touch. A hand-painted sign advertised daily fresh bread and Pine Grove's best cinnamon rolls. The bell above the door tinkled as he entered, and the smell of fresh bread made his mouth water. Warmth from the ovens filled the small shop, along with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon. Mrs. Robinson, a plump woman with silver hair, pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from arranging pastries in the display case. "Why, hello there," she said, straightening up and adjusting her flour-dusted apron. "Elijah, isn't it? How's your mother doing?" Elijah gripped the strap of his bag tighter, his rehearsed story ready on his lips. "She's still sick, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was hoping maybe you had some extra bread today." Mrs. Robinson studied him with motherly concern, noting his too thin face and the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. Something in her heart ached at the sight. "Of course, dear. And you know what? I just made a big pot of chicken soup this morning. Your mother could really use something warm and nourishing." She bustled around the counter, gathering bread and rolls into a paper bag. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching the flour dust in the air and making it look like floating gold. "I could bring the soup by later today. It's no trouble at all. My Henry's watching the shop this afternoon anyway, and I could—" "Oh no, please don't," Elijah said quickly, his heart racing. "Mama doesn't want visitors. She's really tired, and the doctor said she needs quiet. The quietest quiet possible." "That's what he said?" Mrs. Robinson paused, a slight frown creasing her forehead as she added another roll to the bag. "Well, I could just leave it at the door. You wouldn't even have to let me in. No trouble at all, really." "She's sleeping most of the time," Elijah insisted, backing toward the door, his eyes fixed on the exit. "Thank you for the bread, Mrs. Robinson, but I should go now. Mama needs me." As the door closed behind him, Mrs. Robinson turned to her assistant, Sarah, who had been arranging cookies nearby. Sarah was young, barely out of high school, but she had a sharp mind and good instincts. "Something's not right with that boy's situation," Mrs. Robinson said softly, watching through the window as Elijah hurried away. "Have you ever seen his mother? Does anyone know where they live?" Sarah shook her head, her ponytail swaying with the movement. "Come to think of it, I've never seen her in town. And he always seems so nervous when anyone asks about her. Like he's got a script he has to stick to." "Exactly," Mrs. Robinson agreed, absently straightening the display case. "And have you noticed how he never comes at the same time? Always different days, different hours. Like he's trying not to establish a pattern." Throughout the day, similar conversations began sprouting up around Pine Grove like mushrooms after rain. At the post office, Mrs. Robinson mentioned her concerns to Martha Jenkins, who remembered seeing Elijah asking for food at the church picnic last week. Martha told her bridge partner, Eleanor Wilson, who mentioned it to Tom when she stopped by the diner for coffee. "He was here yesterday," Tom said, leaning on the counter. "Same story about his sick mother. But when I offered to visit, you should have seen how scared he looked. Like a rabbit about to bolt." "Has anyone actually seen this mother of his?" asked Mr. Wilson, who was sitting at the counter nursing his third cup of coffee. "I mean, really seen her, not just heard about her?" "Not that I know of," Tom replied, his brow furrowed with worry. "And whenever anyone offers to help or visit, he has some excuse about why they can't. Always something about the doctor saying she needs quiet, or she's sleeping, or she's too tired for visitors." The whispers grew throughout the afternoon, carried on the autumn breeze from one concerned neighbor to another. At the grocery store, Mrs. Peterson, no relation to Tom, told the cashier how she'd seen Elijah picking through the discarded produce behind the store last week. Even Pastor Roberts at First Baptist mentioned to his secretary that he'd been meaning to check on this Williams family, but couldn't seem to find out where they lived. Why did no one know where Elijah lived? Why was his mother perpetually sick, yet never seen by a doctor? Why did the boy always seem so frightened of people helping? The questions multiplied like falling leaves, covering the town in a blanket of worry and speculation. As the sun set on another day in Pine Grove, the town settled into an uneasy quiet. In his diner, Tom wiped down the counter for the 100th time, his mind on the small boy who had become such a mystery. Mrs. Robinson sat in her rocking chair at home, knitting needles clicking as she thought about the strange, evasive child who had visited her bakery. And throughout the streets, concerned whispers continued to spread, carrying with them a growing sense that something was very wrong in their small town. Something involving a young boy who appeared regularly asking for food, but whose story seemed to be unraveling thread by thread. The courthouse clock struck 8, its chimes echoing through the darkening streets. Somewhere in the shadows, a small figure clutched a bag of food and hurried away from the lights of town, carrying with him a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. The truth, whatever it might be, remained hidden in the gathering darkness, waiting to be discovered by those who were beginning to look more closely at the mystery of Elijah Williams and his unseen mother. The following week brought a change to Pine Grove, subtle as the shifting of seasons, but just as inevitable. Autumn's grip tightened on the small town, stripping the trees bare and bringing a biting chill to the morning air. For Elijah Williams, Each day became an increasingly complex dance of timing and strategy, his routine growing more strained with every passing hour. Monday found him at the church food pantry, Tuesday at the back door of Luigi's Italian restaurant, Wednesday sneaking through the farmer's market just before closing. Each stop required a different approach, a different story, though the core remained the same. A sick mother, a desperate need, and always the careful deflection of deeper questions. "Just some soup today. If you have any extra," he'd whisper to Sister Margaret at the church, eyes downcast. "Mama's medicine makes her real hungry," he'd explain to Luigi, who'd slip him leftover bread and pasta. "The doctor says she needs fresh vegetables," he'd tell the market vendors as they packed up their stalls. But people were starting to notice patterns where Elijah tried hard to create randomness. They saw how he never came to the same place at the same time, how he appeared at different locations across town like a ghost, always with that same canvas bag, always with those rehearsed explanations that seemed to ring increasingly hollow. By Thursday morning, exhaustion had begun to show on his young face. Dark circles deepened under his eyes, and his movements had taken on a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. The pressure of maintaining his secret weighed on him like a physical burden, showing in the slight stoop of his shoulders and the constant darting of his eyes. It was on this morning that fate led him to Daniel's grocery, the last place in town he'd managed to avoid until now. The store stood on the corner of Pine and Main, its red brick facade weather-worn but dignified, much like its owner. The bell above the door announced his entrance with a harsh jangle, so different from the gentle chimes of Tom's Diner or Mrs. Robinson's Bakery. Mr. Daniels himself stood behind the counter, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. Unlike the other shopkeepers in Pine Grove, Howard Daniels had never fully embraced the small-town friendliness that characterized the community. He ran his store with military precision, a remnant of his 20 years in the Army, and had little patience for excuses or sob stories. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying across the empty store. The morning rush hadn't started yet, leaving Elijah alone under Mr. Daniels' scrutiny. Elijah clutched his bag closer, already regretting his decision to come here. "Yes, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was wondering if you had any dented cans or expired food you might be throwing out. My mom is sick and—" "Sick?" Mr. Daniels interrupted, coming around the counter. "Sick how? What's the diagnosis?" The directness of the question caught Elijah off guard. "The doctor says she needs rest," he stammered, falling back on his usual explanation. "She gets real tired and—" "Which doctor?" Mr. Daniels pressed, moving closer. "Dr. Thompson or Dr. Harris? They're the only two in town, and I know for a fact neither of them has mentioned treating anyone matching your mother's description." Elijah took a step backward, his heart hammering in his chest. I don't remember his name," he said, edging toward the door. "He was from the city?" "The city?" Mr. Daniels' eyebrows rose. "That's quite a trip for someone too sick to get out of bed. Tell me, son, is your mother really sick? Or is something else going on here?" "She is sick," Elijah protested, his voice rising with panic. She needs—" "What she needs," Mr. Daniels cut in, "is for someone to check on her. Why don't I close up the store for a bit, and we can walk over to your house right now? See what kind of help she really needs." The color drained from Elijah's face. Without another word, he turned and bolted from the store, leaving Mr. Daniels standing in the aisle, watching through the window as the boy disappeared around the corner. Less than an hour later, the bell above Tom's Diner door chimed as Mr. Daniels entered, his face set in grim lines. The morning rush was in full swing, but he made his way straight to the counter where Tom was pouring coffee. "We need to talk about that Williams boy," he said without preamble. "Something's very wrong there." Tom glanced around at his customers before nodding toward the kitchen. "Stacy, watch the front," he called to his waitress before leading Mr. Daniels through the swinging doors. In the kitchen's relative privacy, Mr. Daniels recounted his interaction with Elijah. "The boy's lying, Tom. Clear as day. No doctor, no sick mother. It's all a story, and not even a very good one anymore. Mrs. Robinson said the same thing yesterday," Tom admitted, leaning against the stainless steel prep table. She's been keeping track of his visits, says he's getting more nervous every time. Have you noticed how thin he's getting? Mr. Daniels asked. Despite all the food everyone's giving him? Where's it all going? And why won't he let anyone near his house? The questions hung in the air like the steam from the grill, heavy and impossible to ignore. Tom ran a hand through his gray hair, his face creased with worry. We need to do something, he said finally. But we need to be careful about it. That boy's scared of something, and if we push too hard, we might make things worse. I have an idea, Mr. Daniels said, his military training evident in his decisive tone. Let me make a few calls. By that afternoon, Tom's Diner had become the meeting point for an impromptu council of concerned citizens. Tom, Mrs. Robinson, and Mr. Daniels sat in a corner booth, their heads bent together in serious discussion. They were joined by Officer James Murphy, Pine Grove's most experienced police officer, a man known as much for his compassion as his capability. Officer Murphy listened carefully as each person shared their observations and concerns. His blue eyes, kind but sharp, took in every detail as they painted a picture of a young boy, increasingly trapped in what seemed to be an elaborate deception. He came to my bakery 3 times last week, Mrs. Robinson explained, twisting her apron in worried hands. Different times each day, always looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be following him. And he's getting more careless with his story, Mr. Daniels added. The details don't match up anymore. Today he mentioned a doctor from the city, but last week he told Luigi it was a local physician treating his mother. Tom pushed his coffee cup aside, leaning forward. The thing that worries me most is how afraid he seems of anyone helping. It's not natural for a child to be that frightened of adult assistance unless something's very wrong. Officer Murphy nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I agree this needs looking into, he said, his voice quiet but authoritative. But we need to handle this delicately. If the boy's in some kind of trouble, spooking him could make things worse. Let me observe for a few days, see what I can learn without intervening. The others agreed, and Operation Shadow, as Mrs. Robinson somewhat dramatically dubbed it, began the very next morning. Officer Murphy, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his uniform, began a careful surveillance of Elijah's movements through town. The first day, he watched from his personal truck as Elijah made his rounds. The boy's pattern was clever. Never the same place twice in a row, varying his times, taking different routes between locations. But there was a desperation to his movements that concerned the experienced officer. On the second day, Murphy attempted to follow Elijah as he left town, but the boy's awareness of his surroundings impressed and worried the officer. Every few steps, Elijah would pause, look around, sometimes double back or duck through alleys. 3 times Murphy thought he had him, and 3 times the boy vanished like smoke when he reached the town's outskirts. He's good, Murphy reported back to Tom that evening. Too good for a kid his age. No child should be that practiced at avoiding detection. The third day brought a close call. Murphy had positioned himself near the farmer's market, pretending to read a newspaper as Elijah approached one of the vendors. The boy was asking about any unsold vegetables when something, perhaps a sixth sense, perhaps just luck, made him look up. His eyes met Murphy's for just a moment, and the officer saw raw fear flash across the child's face before he disappeared into the crowd. Did you see which way he went? Murphy asked the vendor. Nope, the old man replied, shaking his head. That boy's like a ghost sometimes. Here 1 minute, gone the next. Been that way ever since he started coming around a few months back. Each day brought new concerns. Murphy observed how Elijah seemed to grow more haggard, more anxious. The boy's clothes, already too big, hung looser on his frame. His movements became more erratic, his visits to various locations more frequent, as if he were gathering supplies for some approaching crisis. He's getting desperate, Murphy told the concerned group gathered at Tom's Diner at the end of the week. Whatever's going on, whatever he's hiding, I think it's coming to a head. Should we confront him? Mr. Daniels asked, his military mindset seeking direct action. No, Murphy said firmly. He's too scared, too likely to run. We need to wait for the right moment, catch him off guard, but in a way that doesn't threaten him. He needs to know we're here to help, not hurt. And his mother? Mrs. Robinson asked softly. Do you think she's really sick? Murphy's expression grew grave. "I'm not convinced there is a mother," he said carefully. "At least not in the way he's described. Something else is going on here. Something that has that boy terrified of discovery." The group fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts about what could drive a child to such elaborate deception. Outside, the autumn wind whistled through the streets of Pine Grove, carrying with it the first hints of winter. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a small boy made his way home, unaware that concerned eyes were watching, caring hearts were worrying, and helping hands were preparing to reach out. The mystery of Elijah Williams had grown beyond whispered concerns into something that demanded action. But as Officer Murphy reminded them, timing was everything. One wrong move could send the boy running, perhaps somewhere beyond their reach to help. So they would wait and watch, and hope that when the moment came to act, they would be ready. As the meeting broke up, Tom stood at his diner window, watching the street as he had so many times before. "Be careful out there, kid," he muttered to the empty night. "Whatever you're running from, whatever you're hiding from, I hope you know there are people here who want to help." But the street remained empty, offering no answers to the questions that hung heavy in the autumn air. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful observation, another day of growing concern, another day closer to whatever truth lay at the heart of Elijah's desperate deception. For now, all they could do was wait, watch, and worry about the small boy who carried such a heavy secret through their town's quiet streets. The autumn wind had turned bitter as Officer James Murphy sat in his unmarked car, watching Elijah Williams emerge from Tom's diner. The boy clutched his usual canvas bag, now bulging with food containers, and started his familiar zigzag pattern through town. But today was different. Today, Murphy wouldn't let the boy slip away. Earlier that morning, he'd witnessed something that cemented his decision to act. Elijah had nearly panicked when Mrs. Peterson offered to drive him home, backing away so quickly he knocked over a display of canned goods at the grocery store. The fear in the boy's eyes wasn't just anxiety anymore. It was pure terror. The incident had drawn attention from other shoppers, and Mrs. Peterson's well-meaning attempts to help had only made things worse. "Let me at least drive you partway," she'd insisted, reaching for Elijah's arm. "It's getting so cold out there." The boy had recoiled as if her touch burned, sending more cans clattering across the floor. His eyes had darted around like a trapped animal's, searching for escape. "No. Thank you, but no. I have to go. My mama's waiting." The lie had sounded hollow even to Murphy's ears, watching from the checkout counter. He'd seen how Elijah's hands trembled as he gathered his scattered belongings, how his voice cracked on the word mama. Something had to give, and soon. "Time to end this," Murphy muttered, carefully pulling away from the curb as Elijah headed toward the outskirts of town. The sun was setting earlier now, casting long shadows that helped conceal his vehicle as he maintained a careful distance. The streets of Pine Grove gradually transformed from well-maintained sidewalks to crumbling pavement as they moved away from the town center. Murphy noticed how Elijah seemed distracted today, less vigilant about checking for followers. His shoulders were hunched against the cold, and his pace was quicker than usual. Twice he nearly stumbled, catching himself at the last moment, his exhaustion evident in every movement. As they left the town's familiar streets behind, Murphy's curiosity grew. The boy was heading toward Old Mill Road, where most of the houses had been abandoned years ago after the lumber mill closed. The skeletal remains of the mill itself loomed in the distance, its rusted machinery standing like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. The road curved sharply around an overgrown lot, and Murphy had to hang back to avoid detection. When he rounded the bend, his headlights swept across an old Victorian house, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. The house had once been grand, with elaborate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch, but years of neglect had turned it into a haunting shadow of its former self. Elijah's small figure disappeared through a gap in the fence surrounding the property, ducking under a "no trespassing" sign that hung askew from rusted chains. Murphy parked his car a safe distance away and approached on foot, years of police training guiding his silent steps. The dried leaves barely whispered under his careful tread. The house loomed before him, its dark windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. Through a crack in one of the boarded windows, a faint light flickered, probably from a battery-powered lamp. The porch steps creaked softly under his weight as he moved closer, and he froze, waiting to see if the sound had alerted anyone inside. A child's giggle drifted through the walls, followed by Elijah's gentle shushing. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in this derelict setting, that Murphy had to take a moment to process what he'd heard. Peering through the gap between two boards, what he saw made his heart catch in his throat. Inside, Elijah sat cross-legged on a worn blanket spread across the floor. The room was surprisingly orderly, given the state of the house. A battery-powered camping lantern cast a warm glow over the scene, illuminating a small space that had been carefully cleaned and arranged. Beside him, a little girl no more than 3 years old bounced excitedly as he unpacked the food from his bag. Her dark curls matched Elijah's, and despite her worn clothes, her eyes sparkled with joy. "Careful, Amara," Elijah said softly, steadying a container of soup. "We don't want to spill it like last time, remember?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "No mess, Elijah. Promise." Murphy watched as Elijah methodically arranged their meal, his movements practiced and precise. The boy's face softened as he watched his sister, a glimpse of the child he should have been showing through his usual mask of worry. As he worked, his mind seemed to drift, his hands slowing as memories washed over him. The first days after arriving in Pine Grove had been the hardest. Elijah had discovered the abandoned house while searching for shelter, carrying a sleeping Amara in his aching arms. They'd walked for days, leaving their hometown far behind, surviving on what little food he'd managed to bring with them. "Stay quiet as a mouse, okay?" He taught Amara from the beginning, demonstrating by pressing his finger to his lips. "If anyone comes while I'm gone, you hide in our special place." He'd spent weeks preparing their shelter, dragging old furniture to block windows, rigging tin cans on strings as makeshift alarms, and creating a hidden space behind a false wall where Amara could hide if needed. Every morning before leaving to collect food, he'd check each security measure twice. "Mouse quiet," Amara would whisper back, practicing their daily routine. She'd crawl into the hidden space, clutching the stuffed rabbit he'd found for her at a church donation box. Sometimes she'd cry when he left, and those moments nearly broke him. "That's my smart girl," he'd praise her, fighting back tears as he locked the door behind him. Each day, leaving her alone tore at his heart, but he had no choice. They couldn't risk anyone finding out about her. The lies had started small at first. A sick mother seemed the simplest explanation for needing food. But keeping the story straight became harder as more people asked questions. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, panic that he'd said something wrong, given away too much. He created routines within routines. Never visit the same place twice in a row. Vary the times. Take different routes. Keep moving, keep lying, keep Amara safe. The weight of it all pressed down on him, making him feel older than his 8 years. At night, when Amara was asleep, he'd look at the photo he kept hidden in his pocket, the last picture taken of their family together. Their mother's smile, already strained by the illness that would take her life just months later. Their father, gone even before that, existing only in Amara's baby pictures and Elijah's fading memories. "I promise I'll take care of her," he'd whispered to the photograph countless times. "I won't let them separate us. I promise." The sound of approaching sirens in the distance would sometimes send him into panic attacks, convinced they'd been discovered. He'd gather Amara in his arms, ready to run, only to realize the sirens were heading somewhere else, to someone else's emergency. The creak of a floorboard snapped Elijah back to the present. He whirled around, instinctively pushing Amara behind him as Officer Murphy stepped into view. The boy's face drained of color, his worst fears materializing before him. "Please," Elijah choked out, tears already streaming down his face. "Please don't take her away from me. She's all I have left. Please, I'll do anything." Murphy raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. His heart ached at the raw desperation in the boy's voice. "I'm not here to hurt anyone, Elijah. I just want to understand what's happening." Amara peeked around her brother's arm, curious but not afraid. Friend, she asked hopefully, her innocent question hanging in the air between them. Elijah's shoulders shook as he pulled her close. Our parents, he started, then had to swallow hard before continuing. Dad died when Amara was just a baby. Car accident. Then Mom got sick. Really sick, not like the stories I told. Cancer. She fought it for a long time, but his voice cracked. She passed away 3 months ago. Why didn't you tell anyone? Murphy asked gently, keeping his distance to avoid frightening them further. There are people who could have helped. The social workers in our hometown. Elijah's voice trembled with suppressed emotion. They came to the hospital after Mom. They said we'd have to go to different foster homes. Said Amara was young enough to be adopted easily, but that he shook his head violently. I couldn't let them separate us. She's just a baby. She needs me. I'm all she has left. Murphy's eyes roamed the room, taking in the details of their makeshift home. Despite the desperate circumstances, he could see how hard Elijah had tried to create a safe, nurturing environment. Crayon drawings decorated one wall, clearly Amara's work. A small collection of books sat neatly stacked in one corner. Old blankets had been carefully arranged into sleeping areas, and a box of toys, mostly salvaged items, sat within easy reach. Everything was organized, clean despite the building's decay. You've been very brave, Murphy said softly, taking care of your sister all alone. But Elijah, you don't have to do this by yourself anymore. Fear flashed across Elijah's face. You don't understand. They'll take her away. They'll say I can't take care of her properly. They'll say, no, Murphy interrupted firmly. I won't let that happen. There are people in town who want to help you, both of you. Tom at the diner, Mrs. Robinson at the bakery, all the people you've been so careful to avoid. They've been worried about you. They care about what happens to you. Amara tugged at her brother's sleeve. Hungry, Legia, she said plaintively. Soup getting cold. The simple statement seemed to deflate something in Elijah. He looked down at his sister, then back at Murphy, exhaustion evident in every line of his young face. The weight of months of fear, responsibility, and loneliness seemed to crash down on him all at once. You promise? He whispered, his voice small and vulnerable. Promise we'll stay together? Murphy knelt down to their level, meeting Elijah's eyes. I give you my word, we'll figure this out together. As a community, Pine Grove takes care of its own. And like it or not, you two are part of this town now. For a long moment, Elijah stayed frozen, years of fear and protective instincts warring with his desperate need for help. Then Amara reached out and patted Murphy's knee, giving him a toothy grin, and something in Elijah finally broke. Okay, he said, his voice barely audible. Okay. Murphy pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number. Tom? It's Murphy. I need your help. And bring Mrs. Robinson too. I've found our mystery, and it's bigger than we thought. As Murphy spoke quietly into the phone, explaining the situation in careful terms, Elijah held his sister close, watching the first stars appear through a gap in the boarded window. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing weight on his shoulders begin to lift, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. The sound of approaching footsteps made him tense, but Murphy's reassuring smile helped him stay calm. The door opened, revealing Tom and Mrs. Robinson, their faces a mixture of concern and compassion as they took in the scene before them. Oh, my dears, Mrs. Robinson breathed, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at the two children. Tom stepped forward slowly, hands full of warm containers. I brought dinner, he said gently. Real dinner, enough for everyone. And tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest. Together. Mrs. Robinson was already making plans, her practical nature taking over. You'll stay with me tonight, both of you. I have plenty of room, and my grandson left some clothes that should fit Elijah. We can get Amara some new things tomorrow. And proper beds, Tom added. Real meals. A safe place to live. As Amara clapped her hands at the sight of food, Elijah felt the last of his resistance crumble. They weren't alone anymore. Finally, after so many months of fear and hiding, they were safe. The wind outside had died down, and through the broken boards, The lights of Pine Grove twinkled in the distance like a promise of home. Amara snuggled against her brother's side, already half asleep, content in the knowledge that her world was secure as long as he was near. Murphy watched as Mrs. Robinson fussed over the children, as Tom began unpacking the food he'd brought, as the abandoned house filled with warmth and voices and hope. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important police work wasn't about enforcing laws. It was about protecting those who needed it most. "Ready to go home?" he asked Elijah softly. The boy looked around the room one last time, at the makeshift home he'd created out of desperation and love. Then he nodded, gathering Amara in his arms. "Yes," he whispered. "We're ready." Together, they stepped out into the night, leaving behind the shadows of their past and walking toward the welcoming lights of Pine Grove, where a new chapter of their story was about to begin. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through Mrs. Robinson's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across Elijah's face. For a moment, as consciousness slowly returned, panic gripped him. He'd overslept. Amara would be scared, alone in the abandoned house. Then reality settled in as he heard his sister's gleeful giggle from somewhere downstairs, followed by the warm, gentle tones of Mrs. Robinson's voice. They were safe. They were together. It wasn't a dream. The bed beneath him was softer than anything he'd slept on in months. The borrowed pajamas from Mrs. Robinson's grandson felt clean and warm against his skin. On the bedside table, a glass of water waited beside a small plate of cookies he hadn't been able to finish the night before, his shrunken stomach unused to such abundance. Elijah sat up slowly, taking in the cozy guest room that Mrs. Robinson had insisted was their room now, for as long as they needed it. The walls were painted a gentle blue, with white trim and flowing curtains that made the morning light dance. A child-sized dresser stood in one corner, waiting to be filled with clothes they didn't yet own. On a rocking chair by the window, someone had laid out fresh clothes. New ones, he realized with a start, the tags still attached. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made him tense instinctively before he recognized Mrs. Robinson's distinctive tread. A soft knock preceded her cheerful voice. "Elijah, are you awake, dear? Officer Murphy and some other folks are here to talk about getting everything sorted out properly." "Coming," he called back, his voice still rough with sleep. As he dressed in the new clothes, jeans that actually fit, a warm sweater in deep green, socks without holes, he caught his reflection in the mirror above the dresser. The dark circles under his eyes seemed less pronounced after a full night's sleep in a real bed. His curly hair, freshly washed with Mrs. Robinson's shampoo, looked less wild. Even his face seemed different somehow, less haunted. Downstairs, he found Amara perched on a kitchen chair piled with cushions, happily demolishing a stack of pancakes. She wore a new pink dress that Mrs. Robinson must have produced from somewhere, and her curls had been neatly braided. At the sight of her brother, she beamed, syrup dripping down her chin. "Elijah, look, Mrs. Rob makes pancakes with faces." Indeed, each pancake had been decorated with fruit to create a smiling face. The simple gesture of kindness, taking the time to make breakfast special for a child, made Elijah's throat tight with emotion. In the living room, he found Officer Murphy seated in an armchair, along with Tom from the diner and a woman he didn't recognize. She wore a neat business suit and carried a briefcase, but her smile was kind as she introduced herself. "Hello, Elijah. I'm Sarah Martinez from Child Protective Services," she said, and his heart nearly stopped until she quickly added, "Officer Murphy called me last night to explain your situation. I'm here to help make sure you and Amara can stay together, legally and safely." The next few hours passed in a blur of conversations and paperwork. Ms. Martinez explained everything carefully, making sure Elijah understood each step. Yes, they could stay in Pine Grove. Yes, they could remain together. No, they wouldn't have to go back to their hometown or deal with the social workers there. "Mrs. Robinson has already applied for temporary emergency guardianship of both of you," Ms. Martinez explained, shuffling through some papers. "And given the circumstances and the community support here, I don't foresee any problems making that permanent if that's what everyone wants." Mrs. Robinson, who had been hovering nearby throughout the conversation, reached over to squeeze Elijah's hand. "Only if you want to stay, dear. But you and Amara will always have a home here." But when Elijah expressed that he didn't want to be a burden to them, Tom cleared his throat, adjusting his position on the couch. "I've got a proposition for you, kid. My daughter Sarah's heading off to college next month, and I could use some help at the diner after school and on weekends. Proper job, proper pay. What do you say?" Elijah looked around the room at these people who had become his allies overnight. Officer Murphy with his steady presence, Mrs. Robinson with her endless supply of love and baked goods, Tom with his practical kindness, and even Ms. Martinez with her determination to make things right. For months, he'd carried the weight of responsibility alone, convinced that adults couldn't be trusted to help. Now, surrounded by their support, he felt something inside him begin to heal. "Thank you," he whispered, then cleared his throat and said it again stronger. "Thank you all." The days that followed took on a rhythm so normal it sometimes made Elijah dizzy. Mornings began with breakfast in Mrs. Robinson's sunny kitchen, Amara chattering away as she helped Mrs. Rob mix batter or set the table. Then Mrs. Robinson would open her bakery, taking Amara with her to play in the small office she'd converted into a makeshift playroom. Elijah returned to school, enrolled in Pine Grove Elementary's third-grade class. The principal, briefed on his situation, arranged for him to get caught up on the months he'd missed. His teacher, Ms. Collins, stayed late twice a week to help him with math and reading, never once making him feel ashamed of falling behind. After school, he'd head to Tom's diner, where he learned to bus tables, operate the dishwasher, and eventually help with simple food prep. Tom proved to be a patient teacher, showing him how to properly stack plates, the fastest way to roll silverware and napkins, and the secret to making the diner's famous chocolate milkshakes. The town rallied around them in ways both big and small. Mr. Wilson from the hardware store showed up one Saturday with his tools and spent the day child-proofing Mrs. Robinson's house. Mrs. Jenkins organized a clothing drive that filled 3 boxes with clothes in both children's sizes. Even Mr. Daniels, whose confrontation had indirectly led to their discovery, made a point of setting aside the best produce for Mrs. Robinson, knowing it would end up in the children's meals. But adjustment didn't come without challenges. Elijah still woke sometimes in a panic, convinced he needed to check on Amara. The first time someone knocked unexpectedly at Mrs. Robinson's door, he nearly collapsed from fear. And leaving Amara with others, even people he was growing to trust, made his hands shake and his stomach clench. "It's okay to be scared," Officer Murphy told him during one of his regular visits. "What you went through, losing your parents, taking care of your sister alone, living in that old house, that's not something you just get over. But you don't have to be scared alone anymore." Slowly, the fear began to loosen its grip. Elijah started making friends at school, real friends, not just people he had to be careful around. A boy named Marcus invited him to join the school's chess club, while a girl named Sophie shared her comic books with him at lunch. For the first time since their parents died, he found himself laughing freely, playing without constantly looking over his shoulder. Amara bloomed like a flower in spring. Mrs. Robinson enrolled her in a local preschool program 3 mornings a week, where she made friends her own age and learned songs she'd sing at full volume while helping in the bakery. Her vocabulary expanded rapidly, though she still called her guardian Mrs. Rob, a nickname that had stuck and never failed to make the older woman smile. One evening, about 2 months after their discovery, Elijah sat on Mrs. Robinson's porch swing, watching Amara chase fireflies in the front yard. The autumn chill had given way to winter's first whispers, and she wore a puffy coat that made her look like a pink marshmallow as she danced and giggled in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Robinson stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. She handed one to Elijah before settling beside him on the swing, its gentle creaking a soothing counterpoint to Amara's laughter. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked softly, noticing his contemplative expression. Elijah took a careful sip of his cocoa before answering. "I was thinking about Mom," he admitted, "about what she'd think of all this, of us being here, with you." Mrs. Robinson was quiet for a moment, watching Amara twirl under the emerging stars. "I think," she said finally, "that she'd be incredibly proud of you. Proud of how brave you were, how you protected your sister, and most importantly, Proud of how you learned to trust again. I miss her, Elijah whispered. Sometimes I wake up and forget for a second that she's gone. Is that normal? Oh, sweetheart. Mrs. Robinson wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. That's more than normal. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. It comes and goes like waves. And all we can do is hold on and remember that we're not alone in the storm. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Amara's firefly dance. The little girl had captured one in her cupped hands and was peering at it with wonder, its gentle glow illuminating her delighted face. Look, Legia, she called. It's making stars. Gentle with it, he reminded her, falling naturally into his big brother role. Remember what we learned about fireflies? Amara nodded solemnly before carefully opening her hands, watching the tiny light drift away into the darkness. Bye-bye, lightning bug, she whispered. Thank you for the magic. Later that night, after Amara was tucked into bed with her growing collection of stuffed animals, Elijah sat at his desk working on homework. Ms. Collins had given him extra credit assignments to help make up for lost time, and he was determined to catch up with his classmates before Christmas break. A soft knock at his door revealed Tom, still wearing his diner apron. He often stopped by after closing to check on them, usually bearing leftovers that Mrs. Robinson would transform into next day's lunches. Got a minute, kid? Tom asked, leaning against the doorframe. At Elijah's nod, he entered the room, pulling something from his pocket. Found this while cleaning out some old files at the diner. Thought you might want it. It was a photograph, slightly creased but clear. In it, a much younger Tom stood behind the diner counter, arm around a smiling woman who could only be his wife. Between them, a little girl, Sarah, grinned at the camera, missing her front teeth. That was taken the day after Jenny, my wife, passed away, Tom said quietly. Sarah was about your age. I thought I'd never smile again, but there we were, somehow managing to keep going. You know why? Elijah shook his head, carefully holding the photograph. Because people helped us. Mrs. Robinson brought us meals for weeks. Officer Murphy, though he was just Officer Rookie back then, checked on us every day. Mr. Wilson fixed things around the house I was too overwhelmed to deal with. This town, it wraps its arms around people who are hurting and holds them until they can stand on their own again. The boy traced the smiles in the photograph with a gentle finger. Is that why you helped us? Because people helped you? Partly, Tom admitted. But mostly because that's what decent folks do. We look out for each other. And now you and Amara are part of that circle. Someday, you'll probably help someone else who needs it. That's how community works. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost patterns decorating the windows like delicate lace. Elijah woke to the smell of cinnamon rolls baking downstairs, Mrs. Robinson's Sunday special. As he dressed for the day, he could hear Amara's voice drifting up the stairs, singing a song she'd learned at preschool about friendly bears and honey pots. Before heading down, he paused at his window, looking out over Pine Grove. The town was waking up slowly, smoke rising from chimneys, early church bells calling faithful to services. From this vantage point, he could see Tom opening the diner for the Sunday breakfast crowd, Officer Murphy's patrol car making its morning rounds, Mr. Wilson sweeping the sidewalk in front of his hardware store. These people, this place, they had become more than just a refuge. They had become home. Not the same home he'd had with his parents, but a new one, built on kindness and trust and second chances. A home where Amara could chase fireflies and learn silly songs, where he could be a kid again instead of carrying the weight of adult responsibilities alone. The fear wasn't gone completely. He doubted it ever would be, but it had transformed from a crushing weight into something manageable, a reminder to appreciate the safety and security they'd found. Each day brought new challenges, new adjustments, new reasons to be grateful for the network of support that had embraced them. Legia, Amara's voice called up the stairs. Mrs. Robb says breakfast is ready. We got cinnamon rolls. Coming, he called back, taking one last look at the town spread out before him. Then he turned away from the window and headed downstairs to join his sister and their new family, ready to face whatever the day might bring. In the kitchen, Mrs. Robinson was setting out plates while Amara carefully arranged napkins at each place, her tongue poking out in concentration. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making the frost patterns glow like diamonds. Outside, Pine Grove continued its Sunday morning routine, its people going about their lives, its streets filling with familiar faces and friendly greetings. And in this moment, surrounded by warmth and love and the sweet smell of cinnamon, Elijah Williams finally felt the last pieces of his heart begin to heal. They were home. They were safe. They were loved. And that, he realized, was everything. 5 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, each season bringing new chapters to the Williams children's story in Pine Grove. Winter melted into spring, spring bloomed into summer, and summers faded into golden autumns, until that fateful day was nothing more than a distant memory, softened by time and healing. Elijah, now 13, stood behind the counter at Tom's Diner, confidently working the register during the Saturday morning rush. He'd grown tall and lean, his once haunted eyes now bright with intelligence and quiet confidence. The official name tag pinned to his apron read Assistant Manager, a promotion Tom had given him on his last birthday. "Order up," Tom called from the kitchen, sliding 2 plates onto the counter. "Table 6, Elijah." "Got it." He grabbed the plates with practiced ease, weaving between tables with the grace of someone who'd spent countless hours in these aisles. As he served the customers, regulars he knew by name, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the diner's window. Sometimes he still found himself startled by how much he'd changed. The door chimed, and Amara burst in, her school backpack bouncing against her back. At 8 years old, she was the spitting image of their mother, with the same wild curls and infectious laugh. Mrs. Robinson followed more sedately, carrying a box of fresh pastries from her bakery. "Leja," Amara called, racing to the counter. "Guess what? I got picked for the lead in the school play. I'm going to be Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz." Elijah grinned, reaching across the counter to ruffle her hair. "That's amazing, Squirt. When's the show?" "6 weeks," Mrs. Robinson answered, setting down her box. "Which means 6 weeks of learning lines, costume fittings, and probably more than a few nervous moments." She smiled fondly at her young ward. "But our girl can handle it, can't she?" Amara nodded enthusiastically, already humming "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" under her breath. The past 5 years had transformed her from a timid toddler into a confident, outgoing child who loved performing in school shows and taking dance classes at the community center. The bell over the door chimed again, and Officer Murphy entered, now sporting touches of gray at his temples. He'd been promoted to police chief 2 years ago, but he still made time for his regular Saturday visits to check on the Williams children. "There's my favorite future Broadway star," he said, catching the tail end of Amara's news. "Tom, I'll need an extra ticket to this show. Can't miss our girl's big debut." The easy way Murphy included himself in their lives, the casual our girl that spoke of years of care and commitment, still touched something deep in Elijah's heart. The whole town had kept their promise, wrapping the Williams children in layers of love and protection until the wounds of their past had scarred over, still visible but no longer raw. Later that evening, after his shift ended, Elijah sat with Tom in the empty diner, sharing a slice of Mrs. Robinson's apple pie. These after-hours talks had become a tradition over the years, a time for mentorship and quiet conversation. "Got something to tell you, kid," Tom said, pushing his plate aside. "You remember Sarah? My daughter?" Elijah nodded. Sarah had visited several times over the years, always bringing stories from her life in the city where she worked as a lawyer. "Well, she's moving back to Pine Grove, taking over Johnston's old law practice when he retires next month." Tom's eyes crinkled with pride. "And she's been asking about you. Says she might need a part-time legal assistant, someone smart who's good with paperwork and people. Someone who might want to learn about law while finishing high school." The offer hung in the air like hope, shimmering with possibility. Elijah had been thinking about his future lately, about what he wanted to do with his life. The idea of helping others, of using the law to protect people who needed it. It resonated with something deep inside him. "You think I could do it?" he asked softly. Tom's answer was immediate and firm. "Kid, after everything you've been through, everything you've accomplished, you can do anything you set your mind to." That night, walking home with Amara skipping ahead, Elijah found himself remembering the desperate boy who'd once hidden in an abandoned house, terrified of being discovered. The contrast between then and now was stark enough to take his breath away. Mrs. Robinson was waiting up for them, as she always did, with hot chocolate and cookies. As they settled into their evening routine, homework checks, story time for Amara, quiet conversations about their day, Elijah felt the familiar wave of gratitude wash over him. "Mrs. Rob," he said suddenly, using Amara's childhood nickname for their guardian. "Do you ever regret taking us in?" Mrs. Robinson looked up from her knitting, surprise clear on her face. "Regret? Oh, my dear boy. Taking you to in was the best decision I ever made. You and Amara brought life back to this old house. Gave me a purpose when I thought my days of mothering were long past." She set her knitting aside, leaning forward. "But what's brought this on?" Elijah twisted his hands in his lap, struggling to find the right words. "Tom offered me a job with his daughter Sarah at her law practice. And it got me thinking about the future, about college, maybe about doing something that matters." "Something that matters?" Mrs. Robinson echoed softly. "Like what?" "Like helping kids like me and Amara. Kids who need someone to fight for them, to make sure they stay together." He took a deep breath. "I want to be a lawyer like Sarah. But specifically, I want to work in family law, helping kids in the system." Mrs. Robinson's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Oh, Elijah, you've already been helping others more than you know. Do you remember the Martinez children last year?" He nodded. A family had moved to Pine Grove under circumstances suspiciously similar to his own. 2 children, clearly afraid, clearly hiding something. But instead of hiding them, the town had known what to do, thanks to the lessons learned from the Williams children. "You were the one who got through to them," Mrs. Robinson reminded him. "You showed them it was safe to trust us, safe to accept help. And now they're thriving, just like you and Amara." The next morning was Sunday, and like every Sunday for the past 5 years, they had breakfast at Tom's Diner before heading to the small cemetery on the edge of town. The tradition had started shortly after they'd settled in Pine Grove, when Elijah had finally felt safe enough to share the location of their parents' graves in their hometown. The community had arranged for them to be moved to Pine Grove, giving the children a place to visit and remember. Amara placed fresh flowers on both graves, arranging them with careful attention. She had few memories of their parents, but Elijah and Mrs. Robinson had helped keep their memory alive through stories and photographs. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad," Amara said softly, her usual chatter subdued in this quiet place. "I got the lead in the school play. I wish you could come see it, but Mrs. Rob says you'll be watching from heaven." Elijah knelt beside her, placing his own flowers. "They would be so proud of you, Amara, just like I am." As they walked back through town, Elijah noticed how many people waved or called out greetings. Mr. Daniels, still running his grocery store with military precision, but now with a softer edge to his manner. Mrs. Peterson, who'd once frightened him so badly with her offer of help, now a regular at his register in the diner. Even the old house on Mill Road, now renovated into a community center, stood as a testament to how far they'd come. The years rolled forward, bringing more changes, more growth, more healing. Elijah graduated high school with honors, his academic recovery complete. Sarah proved to be as good a mentor in law as her father had been in the diner business, guiding Elijah through college applications and eventually law school admissions. Amara continued to bloom, her talent for performing matched by her kind heart and infectious enthusiasm for life. She never lost her love of fireflies, still chasing their light on warm summer evenings. But now she wrote stories about them, filling notebooks with tales of magic and hope. Mrs. Robinson's house remained their anchor, the place where they could always return, always find comfort and understanding. The porch swing still creaked gently in the evening breeze, holding space for conversations both light and deep. The kitchen still smelled of cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, and love still filled every corner. 10 years to the day after Officer Murphy had first discovered them in that abandoned house, Elijah stood before the Pine Grove Town Council. Now a practicing lawyer, specializing in family law and children's advocacy, he presented his proposal for the Pine Grove Children's Center, a place where displaced and struggling families could find help, support, and most importantly, hope. "We know better than most," he told the council, his voice steady and sure, "that sometimes the smallest towns have the biggest hearts. What happened to me and my sister wasn't unique. There are other children out there, right now, facing impossible choices. But what if we could offer them a better choice? What if we could show them that asking for help isn't a weakness, but a strength?" The proposal passed unanimously. Tom donated the old diner building when he retired, and Sarah helped navigate the legal complexities of setting up the nonprofit organization. The whole town rallied around the project, just as they had rallied around two scared children a decade before. On the day the center opened, Elijah stood in the main room, surrounded by the people who had become his family. Mrs. Robinson, her hair now completely silver, but her eyes as bright as ever. Tom and Sarah, arguing good-naturedly about the placement of furniture. Officer Murphy, retired but still involved in community service, helping to stock the pantry. And Amara, now 18 and headed to college in the fall to study social work, hanging artwork on the walls. Her own drawings of fireflies, casting their light into the darkness. "You did it, Leja," she said softly, using his old nickname. "You turned our story into something beautiful." Elijah wrapped an arm around his sister's shoulders, remembering the terrified boy who had once carried her through these streets, running from help instead of toward it. "We did it," he corrected. "All of us, together." That evening, as the sun set over Pine Grove, casting long shadows across streets that had seen both their desperate flight and their triumphant return, Elijah sat on Mrs. Robinson's porch swing. The years had changed the view. New buildings had risen. Old ones had been renovated. Trees had grown taller. But the heart of the town remained the same. Amara emerged from the house, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream, just as Mrs. Robinson had done so many times before. She settled beside him on the swing, its familiar creaking a lullaby of home. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, echoing words from long ago. Elijah smiled, taking a careful sip of his cocoa. "I was thinking about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead us to the best ones. How running away actually brought us home." In the gathering dusk, fireflies began to emerge, their gentle lights dancing in the summer air. Somewhere in town, a child laughed, the sound carrying on the evening breeze. The streetlights of Pine Grove winked on one by one, each a beacon of safety and welcome, just as they had been on that long-ago night when 2 scared children had first arrived. "Do you ever wonder," Amara asked softly, "what would have happened if Officer Murphy hadn't found us that night?" "Sometimes," Elijah admitted. "But then I remember something Mrs. Robb told me once, that love has a way of finding those who need it most. Maybe we didn't find Pine Grove by accident. Maybe this is exactly where we were always meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies rise higher into the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of dinner being prepared, voices calling back and forth, the everyday music of family life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children to help, new stories to unfold. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Elijah Williams looked out over the town that had saved him, the people who had become his family, and the future he had built from the ashes of his past. In the end, their story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation, about the power of community, and about the endless capacity of the human heart to heal, to grow, and to love. The fireflies danced on, their lights a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could still illuminate the way home. And in Pine Grove, where 2 scared children had once hidden in shadows, that light would always burn bright, guiding others toward safety, toward family, toward love. Elijah's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't just about surviving in the face of hardship, but about how far you'll go to protect the ones you love, even when no one knows your struggle. What would you have done in Elijah's shoes, carrying the weight of such a heartbreaking secret? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to fight to keep your family together? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more inspiring and emotional stories like this one.